Sou Maurício Haddad, presidente da DSM América Latina, uma companhia global que atua em nutrição humana, nutrição animal, inovação e vidas sustentáveis. Gostaria de convidá-los para acompanhar a participação
to follow in and participate of co-CEO Global of DSM, Geraldine Marchette, in this 10th edition of the Congress, Sustainability, executed by Sebedis, and will bring about important discussions about the actual current challenges in order to have a fairer and more resilient society and sustainable as well. In the panel, transformation of food systems will take place on the 30th of September at 9 a.m. Geraldine will be talking about important aspects of the topic and how DSM works in order to face this global challenge. Subscribe and stay in touch with the main global topics that are being discussed. We'll wait to see you there.
Olá, bom dia. Eu sou a Renata Nishio e chegamos ao
Good morning. I'm Renata Nishio, and we're on the last day of our Sustainable Congress 2021. Good morning, Renata. Good morning, everybody. I'm Vitor Albuquerque, and today we'll start our last day of the program. In addition to our 3 panels regarding food systems, transformation of food systems, commitment of water with this, today we'll also be receiving the award for women's leadership at Sebedis. We will now start the first panel of the day, the transformation of food systems. In this panel, I have the honor of announcing the launching of the CEO guide about food systems. It is already available for downloading at the CEBDS site. In this panel, we will have Geraldine Marchette, co-CEO and CFO of DSM, Ricardo Guimarães, CEO from B&M Paribas, Celso Luiz Moretti, President of Embrapa, and to moderate, I pass the floor to Alessandra Fajardo, Director of Strategy and Engagement for Agriculture and Environment for Latin America at Bayer. Good morning, everybody. This first panel of the day, the goal is to talk about this transformation of the food systems. I would like to start mentioning the scientific group of UN's food systems that include production, transportation, the industry of processing, retail, and the consumption of food, as well as the impacts on the environment and in health and society. So what we'll be dealing with today is a very complex topic that needs the action of various actors in order to reach a solution. As you know, agribusiness and the business are essential, and here we have a very high influence here in Brazil in our economy. Today, the movement of transformation sustained on these industries are based on the collaboration among many actors so that we may transform these systems into a single one. The risks of these climatic changes, the loss of biodiversity and water resources and the use of the soil are urgent, and they threaten the existence of the industry, of the food systems, and society as a whole. During this year, which is the first year of the Summit of Food Systems organized by the UN, it is a atypical year because there's a copy of the climate and the biodiversity. So we've never had so much impetus to talk about these topics. Sebedis, through a working group of food systems, we've positioned ourselves defending 7 priority points in this transformation here in Brazil, and we've launched a guide for leadership engagement that's mobilizing all of the work with the summit at the UN. This summit involves governments, companies, societies, civil societies, and the academy through this topic, especially topics dealing with agriculture, low carbon, and the combat against the food waste and traceability in order to combat deforestation. This will be the guide and priority in this group at CIBEX. And today, we have with us today are these three illustrious lectures. So we'll be talking about the path to transformation and regarding these three topics that will be prioritized in our working groups. So we'll start questions to Dr. Celso Moretti, President of Embrapa, so then he may help clarify. Embrapa supports Brazil in technology and research and advance in fields since 1973. And it is a reference in technology, a low carbon technology. However, the use of these technologies are a little off our potential. How does this agribusiness sector will conform to these regularities in Brazil in short and long term? And what is the role of Embrapa in this run to achieve this goal? Thank you for your question, Alessandra Ferrado, our moderator. I would like, first of all, to say good morning and to say that it's a great satisfaction for Embrapa to be participating in this 10th edition of Sustentável 2021. On behalf of Marina Grossi, I would like to say hello to all the participants of our event and to say hello to my two panelists who will be here on the first day here and the last day of Sustentável 2021, Geraldine Machete. She's a co-CFO, CEO and CFO of DSM, and Ricardo Guimarães, who is CEO of BNP Paribas. And in order to achieve a neutral economy, a net zero economy, I think that's already been launched. Companies and countries have systematically throughout the world divulged their commitments. China recently has launched its 14th plan, quinquennial plan, where they indicate some commitments and some resolutions in regards to the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. And the Chinese are marking 2060 as the year where they will become a neutral carbon economy. And until 2030, they've promised to reduce, according to the 14th quinquennial plan, they will be reducing in 65% the production of greenhouse gas emissions. And we've all seen in the news this week, I guess, that many regions in China are already drastically reducing energy. There's actually lacking in energy. We've seen this in the map in some areas of China where the central government has decided to reduce the availability of energy in order to stop the emission of greenhouse gas emissions a little because of this commitment that they've taken upon themselves. Brazil's, United States, Australia, and other countries. We've had the summit of leaders in this year of 2021, where they've committed themselves, putting 2050 as a mark in order to become a neutral carbon economy. And some companies here in the Brazilian sector, JBS, BRF, Nestlé, just to mention just three of them, they're also marking 2040 as the limit in order to become companies, net zero companies. I have no doubt, Alessandra, and for those of you who are following us in our Sustentável 2021, that Brazil has total conditions to fulfill and commit to these agreements, to these Paris agreements without a shadow of a doubt. And I can say that for a certainty that a sector of the economy that's, I think, well prepared in Brazil in order to fulfill the commitments of the NDCs is agribusiness. And when I say agribusiness, I say before now and after. Brazil, I think throughout these past years, has invested in two robust strategies to support these goals in fulfilling these goals and these commitments. One of them was the approval in 2012 of the Forestry Code, which is a legislation that limits the expansion of agricultural business and deforestation. Just for you to have an idea, if you're following us in Sustentável 2021, if you have a land in Bio-Amazonia, you can only use a number of hectares, 20 hectares. If you have 100 hectares, you can only use 20 and the other 80 need to be preserved. Another policy is that we need to support the decarbonization in Brazilian culture. I think it's a low carbon plan. And that started back in 2010. And now in 2020, we started the second phase of our plan, which is AVC+. And we've adopted the technologies moved by Embrapa and by supporters that compose the 7 programs of the AVC program. The agribusiness, agri-food sector will contribute in the short, medium, and long term with a reduction of greenhouse gas emissions and the preservation of natural resources, thus qualifying agro to become a sector that's more and more competitive and sustainable as well. Just for you to have an idea, for those of you who are following us on Sustentável 2021 on this Thursday morning, when we've adopted 2020, the biological fixation of nitrogen in approximately 36 million hectares of soybeans, and the system approximately 47 million hectares in the production of grains. The system of integration in forest, in plantation, I think we've stopped emitting hundreds of millions of tons in the atmosphere last year. Just for the nitrogen fixation, just for you to have an idea of the calculation, we've ended up saving 100 billion tons of CO2 equivalent. So Brazil stopped emitting, just for the fixation, biological fixation of nitrogen, 100 million tons equivalent. And so in my first intervention here, Embrapa will keep on supporting agriculture, forestry, developing technologies that will contribute to against the emission of greenhouse gas. In 2020, we've launched together with a great player in the animal protein Marfrig, the neutral carbon meat, which is a meat that's produced in a environment where you have animal components, you have agricultural components, forestry, and methane that's produced by the animals is actually neutralized by the forest itself. This year, we're advancing in low carbon soy, in low carbon milk, and neutral carbon in coffee and cotton, low carbon coffee and cotton. And soon we'll have some more news for you, but the technology developed for Embrapa will be keep on feeding 800 million people or more and exporting to more than 200 countries globally. And Alessandra and my friends, this is all being done in a competitive and sustainable and responsible way through the decarbonization, systematic decarbonization of food systems. So back to you, Alessandra. Thank you, Celso. And now I'll pass the floor to Geraldine Matchett, who is the CFO of DSM. Why and how the commitments launched by DSM, how will they develop an important path in the journey to transformation of the system?
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Alessandra, for introducing me. And thank you, Mr. Moretti, for actually extremely insightful comments on what I knew was the case, which is that Brazil is a leading nation when it comes to using innovation and technology to really transform food systems. So it's an honor to be on this panel. Now, a couple of words maybe briefly about who is DSM. So we are the world leading company when it comes to what makes food and feed nutritious, i.e. micronutrients. So micronutrients that go into feeding animals and us, the humans. Now, to give you an idea, we're an 8 billion turnover company. actually of which about 12% is in Latin America. So we have a very important footprint, including in Brazil, which makes it even more exciting to be here today. Now, Alessandra, you mentioned absolutely correctly that this year is a very special year when it comes to the transformation of food systems. I don't want to repeat data that's been said. We're on day 3 of your event, but still it's very, very critical to remember that on the one hand, our ability to produce enough food on this planet is being rapidly eroded by climate change. And at the very same time, food production is the second biggest contributor to climate change because of deforestation, but also because of things like methane emissions from livestock, which were referred to a second ago. So what we're seeing right now is a little bit of perfect storm in the world of a combination of climate challenges, COVID for sure, but also a lot of events around, unfortunately, conflicts in a lot of parts of the world. So the 3 C's of conflict, COVID, and climate make it an immediate challenge. We went from a climate issue to a climate crisis. We believe that the world is going from a food system issue to a food system crisis, which basically points to we all need to start working a lot more together in order to lead this food system transformation, which is desperately needed in the world. Now, in this context, as DSM, we are actually quite uniquely positioned in the sense that we are able to work upstream with the producers of food, particularly animal protein, animal-based foods, whether it be dairy or meat. But we are also the leader in the world of what makes food nutritious and being able to look at immunity, malnutrition, nutrient deficiencies, and all of those aspects. So what people eat, so how we produce and what we eat. Now, a couple of weeks ago, in the run-up to the UN Food Systems Summit, we decided to add to our very long history of being an ESG stock, so an environmentally, social, and governance-led company. We've added some targets around food systems. Now, why did we do that? Well, it is because we believe that all of us as private companies, or the private sector, we're a listed company, we need to start thinking not only about output, but actually about outcomes. And we have classified them to make things straightforward. What can we do that leads to better health for people? What can we do that leads for better health for the planet? But also the third pillar, how can we support livelihoods? As we all know, the farming industry is a very big industry around the world. There's more than 1 billion people involved in farming, of which, unfortunately, more than half live in poverty, which is ironical when they, of course, are the producers of food for everybody. So that's the reason why we decided to actually put a stake in the ground as a company and say, how can we have a much bigger impact? Now, to give you an idea, we are reaching for things like closing the micronutrient gap of more than 800 million people in the world by the end of 2030. Now, this is really looking at vulnerable populations that are deficient not only in calories, but in micronutrients. It's also referred to very often as hidden hunger. So a very important target that we can only achieve through our science, but also through our partners, such as the World Food Programme, UNICEF, World Vision, and something that is very important for a lot of emerging countries in particular. We're also looking to scale immunity. With the COVID pandemic, it's clear now to the world that the general level of immunity in the population is not high enough. And that's where these pandemics then take enormous proportions. So how can we scale access to ingredients that boost immunity for a lot more people? And that's another one of our targets. Now, looking at the health of planet, we actually looked at the production of food. And here we are a science-based company involved in the micronutrients that go to livestock, to feed livestock, whether it be cattle, whether it be for pork production, poultry. And there are a lot of innovations that can be scaled that reduce, for instance, methane. Now, methane is a greenhouse gas which is 28 times more potent than CO2 in the atmosphere. And you may have heard that 10 days ago, there is a methane pledge which has been made by the EU and the US to reduce methane by 30% by 2030. And I believe that also Argentina and Mexico, I think from Latin America, have already signed up. But this is very important because one of the key sources of methane is livestock. Now, as a company, we have a feed ingredient that can reduce methane emitted by cattle by at least 30%, in the case of beef up to 60 to 80%. And this is simply by adding a feed ingredient. It's a very useful technology, easy to implement. Now we need to work with partners to scale. And I'm pleased to announce that actually Brazil was the first country in the world to give us regulatory clearance for this feed ingredient. So we are free to go ahead and actually make this happen, which, by the way, contributes to the NDCs of Brazil. So a very exciting moment, which is actually all happened in the last 3-4 weeks. So this is why we did these targets, and I look forward to hearing from our other speakers on how we can all work together. There's a lot of examples of, for the private sector audience listening to us, things that you can do as a corporation right now to really support this food transformation, which is required at speed, and I have to say at global level.
Obrigada, Geraldine.
Thank you, Geraldine. I would like to give the floor to Ricardo Guimarães, CEO of PNB Paribas, and get into more of the financial area. And as we mentioned before, we're in a year of huge mobilization for this transformation of food systems to happen, and in part because of what the UN's food system dialogue provided, and also what I talked about of COP15 and COP26 happening in the same year. We know that we can't transform the food systems without the participation of the financial system. And how can BNP Paribas see its engagement, its role in the financial sector and transformation food systems, in particular, considering greater traceability in food system chain? Good morning, everyone. First of all, I'd like to thank CEBEX to participate in this panel. I must confess that it was a mix of happiness and nervousness, because I'm far from being an expert. This is especially compared to Geraldine and Celso Moretti, but when considering the role that BNP Paribas is playing in this transformation role, I see the role as banks and the transformation of the food system and running towards carbon neutrality. We're based in 3 pillars: commitment, financial, and so we have a challenge to feed a growing population with restrictions of land use and water usage and energy as well that are already happening. So within this scenario, we need high performance for biodiversity in long term and carbon neutrality. The financial sector is essential for the transition of financing this process, which is focused in intense carbon processes for future and sustainable low carbon projects. And this challenge for food systems and carbon neutrality should be incentivized in 3 pillars: our policies and our commitments and our investments. In regards of policies, here we updated our agricultural policies, where we defined that by 2025 is our deadline for all our customers to stop deforestation for beef production and soy as well. So it's an ambitious goal and relevant for the environment, but it's also possible. And when we think about commitments in terms of preserving biodiversity, which is a very important issue for sustainable development, And by 2025, we hope to achieve 23 billion euros in financing for land biodiversity and investing over 250 million euros for startups. Where financing is where I think banks have their most important role, and we're on a trajectory where biodiversity and climate indicators will be considered in credit and risk meetings, which will facilitate the transition. We've seen central banks, which regulate the financial system, moving in this direction. And Brazil is in line with a lot of other countries. Through Brazilian Central Bank, the environment risk and the climate risk and the social risk start being part of the total operational costs. And so we've upgraded ESG portfolio, and we have to start looking at the portfolio in broader terms and see the impacts of the environment in this portfolio. Now, how has this been affecting the bank? We have already been very integrated with the ESG in terms of credit, but the credit process and the agricultural and biodiversity issues and ecosystemic will be part of the credit analysis. So we need tools and methodologies to deal with the impacts and how this should be priced and how this affects the customers and how they can honor their financial commitments. And this is because this is all part of what the banks do. So a financial system that's engaged is essential for us to achieve a high and efficient and biodiverse and carbon neutral food system. Thank you, Ricardo. Celso, Dr. Celso, we heard from Geraldine and Ricardo and from you that we have this huge movement towards net zero, carbon neutrality. But there are a lot of people that say that it's not going to be enough to achieve net zero, that we're going to need to recover biodiversity, that we lost too much, and we need to go beyond it. So we need to capture more greenhouse gases than we emit. So we need to regenerate. The agribusiness, agri-food sector has a huge potential for sequestering carbon. And we see this in the data and also in preserving biodiversity so we can increase productivity and ensure food safety. So my question is, what is regeneration and how should we include it in the sustainable development plans in Brazil? It's a great question, Alessandra. Brazil has all the conditions to be one of the world leaders in agriculture and regenerative agriculture. The technique that we're based on is on the most sustainable use and most efficient for use of soil, water, and biodiversity. I think it's important for us to remember that Brazil is the country with the largest biodiversity in the world. So this technique is based on the efficient use of these resources. Also has an allies in regenerative agriculture, the reduction of use in agrochemicals and mitigation or reduction of emission of greenhouse gases. This takes into consideration we have a very favorable environment in the agriculture, tropical agriculture that we were able to develop in Brazil throughout these last 50 years. And it's important, Alessandra, and those who are listening to us today at Sustentável 2021, that in the 60s, Brazil was a country that imported food. We would import beef from Europe, milk from the US, and believe it or not, beans from Mexico. And where Brazil grew consistently with efficiency and technology and sustainability, we became one of the largest producers in the world. And since the 90s, we've been advancing systematically in technologies that help us in this insertion of regeneration of our productive systems. We've advanced systematically with no-till production, which protects soil from erosion, retains humidity, moisture, and retains and sequesters carbon and keeps the carbon in the soil. I don't know if most of you know that 2/3 of the carbon in the atmosphere is in the soil. So through genetic improvements, either through traditional or for GMOs, for scissoring, the biotechnical scissoring, so to speak, we are developing plants that are drought tolerant and more tolerant to extremes, for water extremes and even salinity extremes. We've also advanced in bio inputs, which recently became strategic in Brazil with the creation of the national program for bio inputs. Brazil has a huge potential as a nation in terms of production of bio inputs. Embrapa, in this army of microorganisms, has been studied by Embrapa, and we are developing solutions connected to regenerative agriculture in two major fronts. First is the development of biofertilizers and then biopesticides. Within biofertilizers, I wanted to highlight two products that we launched recently in partnership with the private sector. Embrapa is important to mention that we have several partnerships with the private sector that are here with us. DSM is one of them, Bayer is another, and so many others that are here with us and listening, that we have cooperated and have partnerships with the private sector. And we launched in 2019 the Bioma Phos. There are two bacteria that act in combination with phosphorus retained in the soil to release phosphorus to the plants. So we used it in a huge area, and 1.5 million hectares. In 2022, we hope to use it in 3.5 million hectares will be planted in Brazil with the use of this bio input, Bioma Phos, developed by us and with the private sector. We're talking about 5% of the productive area in Brazil produced with this bio input. I would also like to highlight, and it has to do with climate change and water scarcity and water crisis, is an input called auras. Our researchers developed by observing the dryland areas. We're talking about the shop, the girls that talk about the Northeast and the area, then they know the plant, and we observed that in their root system of the manacaru, there's a bacteria that helps the plant go through that drought period. And that's where we isolated that bacteria, and through a private company, a multinational private company, we developed this bio input that will help us, and we've already tested it in corn, the second crop. And so we've, I apologize, his audio cut off. So biopesticides, I know that is Acera, is a bioinsecticide for larvae and for soy and cotton, which are two very important crops for the Brazilian market. And we recently launched Spodovir, which is a bioinsecticide to control a pest that is very important, fall armyworm, which can decimate quickly corn crop. So I'm getting to the end of my second intervention here, but we recently launched closed a deal with a producer of grains in Brazil, Sheffer, in order to strengthen our work done with the biological controls. And Sheffer is a company that is already investing in bio inputs, is also with our partnership with Embrapa. to hopefully use their bio inputs in the company, and they're hoping to double their regenerative area from 4 to 8,000 hectares by 2023. And like I said in my first answer, Embrapa and its partners have a huge portfolio of technology to aid in decarbonization of production and energy and waters. So potential for generation, regeneration, and space in the circular economy and bioeconomy, national and international. Back to you, Alessandra. Thank you very much, Dr. Celso. The information was excellent. I'd like to ask Geraldine how the innovation pipeline for DSM approaches these most important trends and which are considered essential according to the development to sustainable development.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And maybe let me build and connect with what has been said by my two fellow panelists. And these are innovations that basically lead to traceability. So as I mentioned earlier, for instance, we have a feed ingredient called Bovaer that reduces methane burped by cattle. That's great. We also have other feed ingredients that reduce, for instance, ammonia in the production of pork or phosphorus when it comes to poultry. But it's one thing to be able to have these innovations. What is critical is the traceability, because the financing of the transition to regenerative agriculture, which was very nicely described, all of the innovations that exist in the world, but how do we actually link, firstly, the financing of the starting and converting agricultural practices to these new practices, and also take it as far as possible all the way to the consumer. So another innovation that we did on the back of what is our core, which is the innovation on ingredients, is to look at the mapping of farms at the farm level, so that a farm that decides to shift, that we're able to measure their footprint today, see what practices they're adopting, that their footprint has gone down, which then leads to being able to prove to financial institutions that they're doing the right things, but also to the whole value chain, all the way to the consumer. And in our case, we have developed something called Sustel, which is effectively the mapping for a farm of saying, this is where you are today, and these are the kind of innovations that you can apply in order to move bit by bit to a much more regenerative type of agriculture and be rewarded for it, because that is the most important part of the equation. If the farms are not able to fund this transition and to some extent be rewarded for their efforts, it's very, very difficult to shift from one to the other. Another category of innovations that we actually have to do with food waste. And I'm sure it's been mentioned in previous discussions, but in today's world, unfortunately, we waste in excess of 1/3 of the food that we produce, either in the field or all the way at the consumer. And that equates to 8% of the greenhouse gas emissions of the world, 20% of the fresh water, and more of $1 trillion of economic value is lost because of food waste. So here as well, innovations around food waste is absolutely key. It can go from, again, in our area of expertise, you can add feed ingredients that really help the conversion of grain in the animal. And we know in today's market, for example, where grains are becoming very expensive due to drought, due to production interruptions, that feed conversion is already one aspect of food waste. But there are other things. I'll give you the example of eggs. Unfortunately, in most countries, a lot of eggs are broken. Actually, it ranges from 3 to 12% of eggs get broken and therefore not used. Now, with the right innovations, very simple things, by adding much more vitamin D in the feed of chickens, you can reduce egg breakage by nearly 20% in the food chain. There are so many examples of innovations that are out there, but require scaling. And for that, I really liked the examples already given. And that is, you can't do it alone. A lot of innovations in order to scale need to be worked through with partners, whether it be scaling, the feed additive reduces methane, or whether it's about really stretching our efforts to fortify staple foods, which is, by the way, the best way of addressing malnutrition, something I haven't spoken much about today. But these are the kinds of innovations that are present and that exist in the world. They are just not being applied at scale sufficiently. So my call to action maybe here, I take the opportunity, is leverage the power of these innovations that you already have in Brazil to be the leading nation to the transition to regenerative agriculture. I mean, you have a fantastic history of showing, and I think it was very nicely demonstrated a second ago, of how a nation that was an importer is now the biggest exporter of foods. And you can really lead this revolution in the food systems that we need.
Obrigada, Geraldine. Super importante os temas trazidos por você.
Thank you, Geraldine, for the topics that you brought, especially in regards to the waste that happens throughout the chain, not throughout the entire process. Ricardo, I will be finalizing with my final question to you. As you mentioned, in February of this year, the bank has committed itself to not finance companies without goals, deforestation goals to 2035. So this is a big challenge ahead of us. And how have you implemented this commitment? What were the reactions, 2025, sorry, what are the reactions of the market? And what are the next steps towards that phase? Can we expect a little more ambition? Thank you, Sandra. I think it's an excellent question, and it gives me the chance to complement the previous question. Just to remind you, we announced a new global policy in regards to the agriculture sector, and we brought the focus to combat deforestation in Brazilian regions. And we've built this policy by consulting our clients and the entire chain. We were the first bank to announce this restriction publicly to the financing of soy and meat production that are bred in grounds that are deforested. And so as a goal in 2025, we hope to achieve zero deforestation throughout the entire chain of meat and soy. And in following our clients, we know that this goal is actually very close, and the gaps that we need, I think they're pretty close at hand. And our policy also demands that clients may trace these chains directly and indirectly, and these efforts to combat deforestation, they have to be monitored and publicized. I think we need to be transparent regarding this topic of the Brazilian process in the entire chain. I think this is actually a prerequisite in consumption regions, especially coming from Europe. And regarding implementation, all of our social and environmental policies, they are supported by tools that allow this follow-up of the criteria that are aligned with this global standards. In the case of the policy based on agriculture, it's based on accountability framework emission principles, and we will keep on updating these principles, these policies accordingly. In addition to the engagement with clients, like I said, and through an approach that was very much constructive and collaborative, we've been able to talk to the entire sector and all of the initiatives in Brazil and internationally speaking, in order to understand what our trajectory towards zero deforestation is going to happen, and try to identify solutions that may support clients and that the bank can also help support in the transition. We were very happy with the reaction of the markets. They were very positive. We've been seeing more and more national and international companies that are strengthening their commitments towards the combat against deforestation, and having actions like traceability and indirect chains in innovation, engagement with suppliers, and so on. And looking at the Brazilian case specifically, I think the next steps will be to support agriculture in terms of combating deforestation. I think here in our bank, we deal with big companies, and sometimes we don't have access to the producers directly. Like we mentioned, within the process itself, we don't support this kind of clients. And so we're trying to offer credit solutions that can help benefit the agricultural business, and which has shown an environmental responsibility. And fortunately, I think this is what's going to be happening soon. And we also have a partnership with great clients in the agribusiness, but banks and cooperatives that are also financed
Eu acho que são
directly.
desafios, mas
I
acho
think there are a lot of challenges ahead, but with all of the technology that we've been developing in Brazil throughout this entire time, it's a clear sign that Brazil has the necessary technology in order to overcome this challenge, and the tools, like Geraldine mentioned, that are available. And with this, we are on the right path to make this transition happen towards a low carbon economy focused mainly in the agricultural Brazilian business. Thank you, Ricardo. And I think that you've summarized this perfectly on what we've been discussing during this panel. We started making clear that we've already started the net zero process, and a lot of companies in our country have already committed themselves to it. Celso has talked that agriculture can contribute with the reduce of greenhouse gas emissions, and brought these incredible numbers regarding the fixation of nitrogen, direct planting, and how everything is impacted. And you also brought the importance of the financial area to this equation, and that a transformation, like you said, regarding the political pillars, regarding deforestation, regarding meat, the commitments and the relationships with biodiversity and with financing, where we have these climate indicators that will also be critical in these credit evaluation. I think they can change history and bring and establish a great support against deforestation. I really liked it when you said that support is directly linked to environmental responsibility. I think we start changing our perception and we start changing our status quo. We also know that Brazil is a leader in regenerative agriculture, and it's been showing the tropical agriculture and the development of biofertilizers. And from the industry's perspective, we also brought the role of the development in research and innovation focused not only in traceability of these products, but also in the importance of reducing this waste in food. It also made clear that we need to map and support the actions of new practices of these producers. And at the end of the day, they may be compensated for that. I would like to also make clear that these chosen topics by RGT of food transformation systems with low carbon and regenerative processes to combating waste in food and traceability in order to combat deforestation. I think you were able to show us the entire path and the path that we still have ahead of us, and where we still need to be supporting these topics in society. I thank you for your presence, and I pass the floor to our Master of Ceremony. Thank you, Alessandra. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to all participants. We'll make a short pause for about 30 minutes, and then we'll be starting our second panel at 10:30. See you then.